he's also just mashing it in recruiting. They had their Big Cat weekend at Auburn over the weekend, and it's like just an avalanche of commitments, including 2 flips from Alabama. I mean, obviously this was the plan to time it out this way, but did Auburn expect it to be this fruitful?
Yeah, they did. No doubt about it. I was talking to people on the plains earlier in the month, and when Alabama had their run where they were number 1 overall for a while, Auburn just kind of stayed cool and was like, be patient. And from what I was understanding, there is a sense of a shift in Alabama where Auburn is now becoming the destination place. I always talk about how the 17-year-olds who are being recruited as 25 recruits, and now when you see them recruiting the 26 class, these guys are even younger. Well, they haven't seen Auburn play championship football. There's no recency bias when it comes to their championship prowess. So for Hugh Freeze to do the job that he's doing, to introduce Auburn as a place that you want to go, to beat teams like Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State for players, that's huge. And I think that right now you're starting to see the beginning of what could be a powder keg in Auburn, Alabama.
I hadn't thought about it that way, Dukes, but it's interesting. So these kids were 5. They were in kindergarten when Cam Newton led Auburn to the national title. They were 8 for those Nick Marshall teams that like they have not seen that. But right now, I believe they got commits from 8 of the top 10 players in the state of Alabama for 2025, which is a massive shift from when Brian Harsin was there. And we always thought Auburn would recruit well in the NIL era, but it does seem like Hugh Freeze has sort of figured something out.
When you're recruiting against Auburn, you're recruiting against Hugh Freeze. When you think about, sometimes you have guys where the defensive coordinator or you have a recruiting specialist on staff where you're going against Hugh Freeze. And I think that's something that you were missing in the previous regime where Brian Harsin was more of a CEO type guy. So there hasn't been that type of energy with these guys where it comes to having direct contact with the head coach. Hugh Freeze is a recruiter. If he was selling me something, I'd buy it. And right now he's doing the same thing on the recruiting trail where you're able to lock down the majority of the good players in Alabama. And the last time that we saw somebody put a fence around Alabama like this is when Nick Saban started his run.
Yeah, you're exactly right, because that's kind of what drove Tommy Tuberville out at Auburn is Nick Saban was just outworking and whipping Auburn's butt. You're talking about Julio Jones, you're talking about Rolando McClain. It was just a kind of an avalanche. The 2008 class is really where it came home to roost. Now, I know Rolando had committed to Mike Shula and Nick signed him, but like that 2008 class, they got every good player in Alabama, and it felt like they got every good player in Alabama for about 3 years.
Man, it lasted a long time before Auburn was able to grab one of those more highly rated guys. I mean, when you and the guys that actually panned out, it got into the late 2010s before Auburn really started to kind of shift the momentum when it came to like top rated players. You think about a guy like Marlon Davidson, he was the guy who helped shift the program, and when he became a senior, those junior and senior years, Auburn was good and they were competitive. When Auburn wasn't getting those type of game changer players and the best players in Alabama, they weren't competitive. And you started to see that, and multiple coaches have felt the wrath of an unhappy and uncompetitive Auburn fan base. So now when you have right now you have Auburn happy off of the field, now Coach Freeze has to do it on the field. You go out here, you get 8-9 wins against this schedule, then I think you see the start of something special.
I'm glad you mentioned that. So we're going to talk second-year coaches. We're going to start with Hugh Freeze and Auburn. Before that, I got to remind everybody, this show, you see the little dog on my shoulder right here. This show is sponsored by Rhoback, the makers of the world's most comfortable hoodies, polos, shorts, and swim trunks. Use the code ANDY at rhoback.com. That's RHOBACK.com for 20% off for all new customers. By the way, not just for the guys. Great clothes for the ladies, too. The active dresses, the skirts. They got everything. My daughters told me, listen, just get me Rhoback for Christmas. I want a bunch of Rhoback. So it is stylish. It is perfect for any activity that you have coming up. I got a fishing trip coming up this weekend. I will be wearing my Rhoback Performance hoodie. I promise you that. RHOBACK. Use the code Andy, 20% off for all new customers. All right, Dukes, let us talk Auburn on the field this year. We saw him at SEC Media Days. Peyton Thorne came, talked about how different things are this year. I'm curious. We've talked a lot about Cam Coleman, the freshman wide receiver. It's not just Cam Coleman, but how can the receiving core help Peyton Thorne in Hugh Freeze year 2?
I think one, being more consistent catching the ball. One of the things was, like, I always growing up, and you know this too, Andy, if you have a quarterback that's struggling, the last thing you can do is drop a ball when he puts it on the money. And we saw that way too many times last year. It's very deflating when you have when things aren't going the best and the quarterback makes a heck of a throw and the wide receiver drops it. So we saw that way too many times last year. I think also you have veteran guys who've done it on a larger scale. When you think about a guy like Robert Lewis coming out of Georgia State, who's really like he reminds me so much of what was the guy from Louisville last year, the wide receiver who transferred in?
Jamari Thrash.
Thrash. It reminds me so much of Jamari Thrash. They had the same trainer in Atlanta. So I think that's a guy who has documented production, who can play the perimeter and the slot. And then you think about Keandre Lambert-Smith from Penn State, who's also done it on a high level. Now you have veteran guys who, when things are going wrong, there's somebody who can go and tap Peyton Thorne on the backside and say, "Come on, bro, you got this." And I don't think he had that last year with any of the guys who were on that in Auburn's receiving core last year. Not to say they were bad, but they weren't this good, and I think that makes a difference.
And who should we be looking at on Auburn's defense this year? Because it felt like that group was a little more steady, dealt with the offense being inconsistent. They could be rewarded if the offense is better, but who do opposing offenses need to worry about?
I think this renaissance in Auburn recruiting started with Kayan Lee, who flipped from Ohio State at the end of that year. He's an absolute dog out of Cedar Grove High School in Atlanta. Goes about 5'11", a little bit undersized, and he plays with that chip on his shoulder. Last year, he was thrown into the fire. They left a man-to-man a lot of times, and he actually graded out pretty well. Had a bad game against LSU, but who didn't? I think far as using that experience this year, I think he's basically played against first-round picks, and now he's after a year of being in that system and being able to do a little bit of everything. Now you bring in a guy like Charles Kelly to partner with Wesley McGriff, who can kind of give him some feedback on how to use him. I think you'll see Kayan Lee turn into a star this year.
Charles Kelly, we probably should have mentioned that when we were talking about Auburn's recruiting. Getting Charles Kelly back on the Plains. This is a guy who, when he was at Alabama, was very successful as a lead recruiter on some really important people like, Will Anderson. So this is a guy who can help them on the field and in recruiting. The other thing I noticed with Auburn that I think is interesting, because Auburn was very active in the portal this year, especially on defense. But if you look, it was more like depth building on defense. It was not necessarily we've got to get this guy to come in and start. But you look at some of those defensive linemen like Phillip Bleedy, Tro Carter, like whether they start or not, they're going to be in the rotation. And we always talk about having a deeper D-line rotation and how in the SEC it's absolutely critical. That's the part I'm interested to see is how deep did they make their D-line in terms of whoever the starters are there people who can give them 20 reps a game fresh that they feel confident in?
Yeah, and I think those 20 reps are super important when it comes to the fourth quarter. Staying fresh. We saw in the fourth quarter last year when Georgia just started to kind of lean on them, run the ball better, and then they just started going to Brock Bowers. Well, some of that stuff can be attributed to the defensive line not being deep, because as they start to lean and you have to start to bring down extra people to help to stop the run, now you're getting one-on-one situations with one of the best tight ends in the history of college football. So I think that hurts you. So bringing that depth in, you're able to keep guys fresh, and you're able to stay fresh at the point of attack, which I think is super important in the SEC, because of all the passing stats and all the great quarterbacks, it still all starts with the run. And if you cannot stop the run, it's an issue. And I think by bringing in guys who have that run stopping pedigree, like you talked about, like a guy like Tro Carter or a guy like Phillip from Indiana, I think these guys help, and you beat people for these guys. I think when we talk about recruiting, even in the transfer portal, is not who you got sometimes, but if you want to know how good a guy is, it's who you beat. And I think by having guys who the LSUs of the world, keeping him off of LSU's roster says a lot.
Well, and also we've had a big discussion about LSU and the D linemen where basically they felt like the prices got too high in the spring transfer portal, didn't end up taking anybody, may not have that depth on the D line this year. Like that's something they're going to have to deal with. And they were trying to address it, but Auburn did address it. So again, you mentioned earlier when we had the schedule up and you said if they can win 9 games against that schedule, that's a roaring success. And you look at it, so they got to play Oklahoma, Georgia, Missouri, Texas A&M, Alabama. They're at Kentucky. That's not going to be easy either. I think you're right. If you go 9-3 against this schedule, you're actually probably getting talked about as a fringe playoff team. I don't know if you make it, but everybody would be pointing toward Auburn 2025 as a playoff /SEC /national contender.
Absolutely. And I think that if that happens, you see Auburn go ahead and break the bank for whatever quarterback is out there in the transfer portal. If you build that type of momentum and you have that roster set and then you have the Cam Coleman, he does what he does, and you've got a guy like Can Lee who you know is probably going to the NFL draft next year, you've got to strike next year with that first class that you brought in. And so you can also continue to build around that class and the synergy that's going on in Auburn. So I think that's when you really see – people think that Auburn has been like really just, they've got the NIL going. Wait until they win some football games. Then you'll really see the bank open up, man.
Yeah, and it's funny because you forget like the Brian Harsin years, and it was only 2 years, but it was so frustrating for the Auburn people because it was not what Auburn has been historically as a recruiting program, and it was like somebody was trying to do something, trying to make them something they weren't. And I think now they look at with Hugh Freeze, they can go back to being what they have been and what they historically are. And I go back to Hugh Freeze when he was at Ole Miss. It was the second class that he put together, the 2014 class with Robert Condici and Laquan Treadwell and Laramie Tunsil. That was the one that really elevated them, that made it different. Now, the difference now is people aren't going to go, well, how did you get those guys? You're not supposed to get those guys. Like, one, we're used to Auburn getting good recruiting classes, and 2, NIL.
I think, and the way that Hugh Freeze is doing it, I think the best part that I've seen. I was in the facility earlier this year. Laramie Tunsil comes there every offseason to work out with Coach Dom Stanisky every year. So when you see an offensive lineman who's one of the highest paid offensive linemen in the NFL saying, hey, these are my guys, and wherever they are, I'm going to be here, that helps. And what place was Auburn always kind of deficient in, even when they had top 10 classes? The offensive line.
Yep.
This year, now this is going to be the best offensive line haul Auburn has ever had. They have never had this type of depth and this type of athleticism along the offensive line. And I think they're going to help, and you may see them get a guy like an Andrew Babalola or another 5-star. You already got a 5-star pedigree guy in Broderick Schull from Kansas. So now with the offensive line recruiting, this is kind of that second year where it's like where he had at Ole Miss, where it was like, hold up, Auburn's doing what? Or Ole Miss just got who? That's what you're going to see along the offensive line. Somebody said, what was Harsin even doing for 2 years? Chilling and football. One thing I'll say about Brian Harsin, he wasn't letting anybody stress him out. 0. Always cool as a cucumber. You wasn't going to see him mad. Hey, you're not recruiting. Hey, I'm a football coach. I'm a CEO. He was so cool. He always treated me well. But when it came to recruiting, that just wasn't his thing.
Yeah. Unfortunately for him, it's Kirby Smart's thing. It was Nick Saban's thing. And it's definitely Hugh Freeze's thing. So I'm excited to see Hugh Freeze in the era of I can talk to my quarterback directly into his helmet. We've talked about that in the past. I think that's a big one for him, for Lane Kiffin, for Mike Norvell, for those guys who are the play calling head coach who can, there's just people who see things on the sideline. We were talking to Jed Fish, the Washington coach, and he worked with Steve Spurrier coming up. And Steve Spurrier was the ultimate of I'm on the sideline, but I can see things that you can't see with your guys in the press box. And Hugh Freeze is one of those guys too. I've always been amazed at what he can spot in real time, get that play in, get the attention of the quarterback. Hey, do this, do that. Now you can actually talk to him. I do think that's going to help Peyton Thorne, or if Walker White winds up having to play as a freshman, I think they're going to be all right. Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples on 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.